armored vehicles approached the Russian defenses at the tree line. They took hits from drones and RPGs, but they pressed on to deliver their troops while firing at the enemy positions. Now, there was a new challenge for the men moving among the trees, surviving a tough battle against the well-positioned Russian defenses. Other soldiers faced an even greater challenge, hiding from the threat of drones. After their vehicles and squad were decimated in a failed attack, Kursk continued to burn with violence that month. The world seemed closer than ever to nuclear war. At the end of 2024, Russian promises to escalate the war kept increasing, with every fragile and cowardly move by the West to decide to help Ukraine. A threat came from the Kremlin. This cycle developed over years of war, but among the latest problems was a Russian action. Rumors of a North Korean presence in Kursk. If before, North Korea had already supplied massive amounts of ammunition to the conflict to support the Russians, now there was news of more than 10,000 men ready for combat. One of the world's greatest military powers, Russia now had the direct support of another nation on its soil. This leads to an interesting analysis about a select group of virtual soldiers who defended ideology more than they analyzed the conflict. Some military analysts with asymptomatic genius listened when the Russians spread propaganda that it was the NATO army fighting on the Ukrainian fronts. It was contradictory to believe that and, at the same time, believe in the threats from Putin and Lavrov, the same ones who loved the Kremlin's threats to escalate the war over any kind of Western threat, such as, for example, allowing the use of American missiles inside Russia. They believed that NATO troops had entered Kursk inside Russia itself for 3 months. And all that Putin had done during that time was complain and ask for support from North Korea. The intellectual level required to believe both things at the same time. A NATO invasion inside Russia and Russia not retaliating after so many threats. It was as shallow as a shadow at noon. It was the same as calling Putin a coward in the face of a NATO invasion of his country. By saying that, we're not denying Russian power. That's not it. It's about individuals with minimal reasoning ability who believe anything. It's not about doubting the power of Moscow's armed forces. They're certainly one of the largest in the world. And propaganda is part of war, but it seems there's no limit to the absurdities that many people believe. Continuing the story, the biggest escalation during this time was the presence of North Korean troops inside Russia. It started with a series of rumors and strange footage of soldiers training. As the news gained momentum, there were rumors of attacks against these troops here, and even the death of officers. It was still hard to confirm their presence on the front lines for over a month. Some said they were being prepared for combat, which is more time than some Russian recruits spent in training before going to Kursk. After the announcement about the North Koreans in Kursk, there was international pressure. Strangely, the Russians have always used the presence of the Foreign Legion or ex-soldiers from any country inside Ukraine as propaganda, calling it absurd. Strangely, the same armchair military intellectuals have always criticized this, supporting the armed forces, which had one of the largest mercenary groups in the world, which recruited prisoners, in addition to bringing to their front people from various impoverished nations, including the participation of groups like the Houthis from Yemen. They aim to foster collaboration, in addition to reports of people being deceived into fighting on the front lines of one of the most violent wars in the world. The Russians were using whatever they could. Their contracts increased the amounts to be paid in different oblasts and republics of the Federation to try to maintain the same level of recruitment. Salary offers were up to 10 times higher than the average salary in Russia. A Russian military recruiter was filmed trying to persuade migrant workers in Russia to sign a contract with the Ministry of Defense and go to the front line in Ukraine. As benefits, they would receive a Russian passport, free medical treatment, life insurance, and a salary of 200,000 rubles, which is equivalent to $1,000. The Russian government enacted a law that allowed the recruitment of individuals who were imprisoned or under criminal investigation into the Russian armed forces, even before their cases were judged. All of this was to continue the heavy and powerful response that allowed the Russians to almost collapse the Ukrainian defenses in Donetsk. Their advances created devastation over Kiev's defenses in that oblast, one of the main fronts of combat, and it contained a good part of Ukraine's high-value natural reserves. So many Russian advances and now the possible presence of North Koreans have generated an international reaction. The pressure led the most cowardly Western governments to finally allow the use of their weapons inside Russian territory. If it had been years earlier, many planes that bombed civilian areas could have been destroyed. Now the effects wouldn't be the same anymore, but the Ukrainians used them. Kiev's planes flew to drop the projectiles on Russian territory. The Storm Shadow missiles leaked into the skies toward Kursk. On November 20, 2024, Russia tried to stop these high-precision projectiles. Medium-range surface-to-air missile systems were ready to intercept the enemy, and shots searched for the Storm Shadow in the skies. According to the Russians, the Buk and the S-400 managed to intercept them. Ukrainian sources said that the attack hit a base of the Russian Presidential Affairs Directorate in Marino, in the Kursk region, resulting in significant military casualties. At the communications center, sources reported the death of a senior Russian commander. The strike on the underground facility killed 18 soldiers and wounded another 33. In the subsequent incident, 13 Russian sappers were injured during efforts to neutralize unexploded munitions at the site. North Korean officers were also reportedly injured. There were even Ukrainian sources reporting the death of 500 North Korean soldiers in a Storm Shadow attack. On November 23rd and 25th, it was the turn of the American ATACMS missiles to fly. The launches targeted military facilities and an airfield in the Kursk region in western Russia. The Russians tried to stop the arrival of the missiles with the S-400 defense system. Their operators were already prepared for the weapons launched by the Ukrainians. According to pro-Moscow sources, they succeeded, but the images told a different story. The MS attacks exploded on the ground, hitting some targets. Shortly after, news began to emerge about Russian soldiers killed during the attack. They were operators of the two destroyed S-400 systems. No, these Ukrainian actions could make it seem like the Russians had less power. In fact, the Russians had the technology and military power for an extensive war. Like any force in the world, there were moments when they would face difficulties. In response to the attacks from British and American weapons used by the Ukrainians in Kursk, Putin ordered the use of the Orishnik, a missile capable of flying at 12,300 kilometers per hour, difficult to intercept. The projectile could carry nuclear warheads. It flew to strike Dnipro, at a military-industrial complex used to manufacture missiles and other weapons. According to the Russians, the attack, which was not nuclear, was a success because it hit its target Moscow's troops have launched increasingly harsh counterattacks against the Ukrainians. The battles in Kursk became difficult for Kiev's forces, who constantly lost ground, with more and more troops appearing in the region for a counteroffensive. But the Ukrainians had strategies to continue fighting there. Various weapons would break metal and lives on Russian soil. The Russians deployed 50,000 men to retake Kursk, while much of the contingent used up to that point came from local forces or troops withdrawn from other parts of the front. Now, there was evidence that the soldiers hired for the task were more recent recruits, specifically for that front. Many cities were retaken starting in September. The Russians targeted the eastern and northern fronts of the areas taken by the Ukrainians and pushed to retake almost half of the invaded territory. Columns of Ukrainian equipment were destroyed. The Russian focus on these areas happened because they were weaker points and more recently captured by the Ukrainians. The bombs that fell near Kursk marked the ground to highlight the places where Moscow was passing through. Ukrainian squads retreated, waiting for reinforcements. Experienced men hardened by war who would face the Russians with new weapons. With that, Moscow's troops kept pressing forward until they reached places where Kiev's soldiers had been since the beginning of the invasion. In August 2024, one of the conflict points became Novo-Ivanovka. The Russians mainly reached there from Lyubomovka by that time. The Ukrainians had already deployed other groups to fight in Kursk, such as the 47th Brigade, which resisted for months against the concentrated advances in Avdiivka until its fall in 2023. The brutal Russian offensive against Avdiivka forged the 47th Brigade in steel, forced to fight against overwhelming numbers and dozens of fragmentation aviation bombs falling every day. The 47th men have already announced their arrival. With their drone battalion, the Strike Drone Company launched their kamikazes so precisely against a BMP-3 that it blew up. Still on the way out of Lyubomovka, a Russian column tried to move in from the same direction. They followed the main road instead of taking the fields, a risky strategy because of the surprises the Ukrainians left on the asphalt. This mistake had already cost the first armored vehicle, which exploded on an anti-tank mine, blocking the way for the others. The second armored vehicle didn't stop, starting to push the metal remains of the other and forcing its way through. It found another mine next to the first one, which exploded. Smoke spread once again among the damaged metal. The third one made the same mistake, perhaps thinking there were no more mines. Another one disappeared into the smoke. The armored vehicles in the column that were still able to move were pursued by the drones. They were blown up under the assault of the flying demons from the 47th Brigade, most of the time under the watchful eye of another drone, which was already searching for its next target to devour. The column still persisted. This time, anti-tank guided missile and tube-launched, optically tracked, wire-guided projectiles started being aimed at the brave ones who kept moving toward Novo-Ivanovka. Their metal twisted, just like the first ones. The men who survived these attacks tried to hide in the remains of the Russian villages, but the drone pilots were always alert. The kamikaze dove at the Russian soldier in an explosion so violent that it threw him. He disappeared in the middle of the smoke, and the drone operators had to look for him to confirm the casualty. They found him in the middle of the destroyed house, moving what was left of his legs while waiting for rescue, so that they could find him before he bled to death. If he survived, he would have a medal on his chest as gratitude and a forgotten name among those who suffered in Kursk. The Russians knew that the drone operators were one of the Ukrainians' lifelines since they had much less artillery and air power. That's why these men were hated. Once detected, their coordinates were passed on to the Su-35s. The planes took off to show who really owned the skies. Heavy fragmentation aviation bombs fell on the tree lines where the drone operators were. Part of that anger, along with the fact that their columns were stopped by drones, made the Russians execute some of those operators who surrendered. As an excuse for the monstrous act of murdering unarmed and surrendered men, it was said that it was retaliation for 2 Russian prisoners of war who were executed. But this was not an isolated event. The Russians continued with frequent execution of prisoners, with groups on social networks encouraging the act. When the Russians made their way to Nova Ivanovka, the 47th Brigade sent their Bradley infantry fighting vehicles and the Abrams tank to avenge their fallen drone operators. The Russians resisted from inside the houses where they had hidden. 2 Bradley put its M242 Bushmaster cannon to work on the Russians. The rounds, flying at over 1,000 meters per second, could easily break through the houses. The impacts cracked the walls, brought down barriers until they reached Russian flesh. The M1A1 Abrams tank came later, much heavier and even criticized for its use in Ukraine. It was a preferred target for the Russians, who celebrated its destruction in the fields of Donetsk. This one went down the street of Nova Ivanovka in Kursk with them 256 cannon, making good use of its 125 mm, sliding the ammunition against the Russian houses. One shot tore down the buildings as if they were made of paper, burying the hiding Russians. The Kremlin soldiers saw those American symbols on their soil and snorted at the audacity. Their drones followed the movement of the Bradley and Abrams up to a tree line. When the tribulation stopped, the Skander missile was prepared and launched against the soldiers of the 47th Brigade. The voracious heat spread, twisting the metal and reducing human existence to ashes. Those who survived were shaken by the attack. A Bradley appeared to rescue the survivors and the wounded, but the Russians had a trap prepared. The drone watched them until the vehicle stopped. The men ran to the open door. As they started to climb the ramp, the grenade fell on them. The explosion caught soldiers, both healthy and wounded, who were gathered there. The impact spread, tore through lives, and caused injuries. The 47th was not shaken by that attack. The brigade kept putting their Bradleys to work against the Russians. The Ukrainian armored vehicles moved toward the tree lines where the opponents were. They went through the path previously cleared in the minefield and past the Dragon's Teeth, with the smoke deployed to give them cover. The defense was reinforced with a new round of smoke bombs before the fighting broke out in full force. The Bushmaster cannons of the Redleys began to fire. The distance between the 2 vehicles allowed them to converge their shots, while still keeping the Russian fire scattered across the field. There was a pause so that the 1st Bradley could fire a tube-launched, optically tracked, wire-guided missile, a long-range anti-armor weapon system. They began the advanced protocol. One Bradley moved while the other opened fire, switching roles consecutively. Missiles exploded in the trees, knocking the Russians down. The advance continued, with the Bushmaster heating up as its high-velocity rounds tore through trees searching for the Russians. Ukrainian artillery fired more smoke shells, increasing the Bradley's cover. While the Russians could only see the whitened air, the Ukrainian vehicles had the enemy bodies' movements clearly highlighted on their thermal cameras. The 1st Bradley reached the tree line. The steel rode in motion beside the Russian positions while the cannon kept pressing the enemies. The 2nd Bradley stopped, creating a wall of fire, while the 1st continued its sweep. Further back, the Abrams tank brought its secondary weapon to bear, firing the M to Browning. Lives were swept away by 12mm rounds, wandering among the trees. The operation ended with the Bradleys and Abrams returning safely. The Bradley proved to be a tough vehicle, but Russian firepower and the variety of attacks were capable of completely destroying the armored vehicle, which caused several of them to be abandoned in Kursk. There was no metal that wouldn't burn in that war. One was severely hit during the evacuation of troops, Ish. When it lost the ability to move, its crew had to flee, heading for the tree line. But it wasn't easy to escape. In that conflict, Russian drones came for their lives, crashing into flesh and trees. In other cases, the Bradleys demonstrated their resilience and maneuverability. They used the strategy in pairs. The weight of the war machine conquered Russian soil. The cannons thundered their shots against the enemy defenses at the tree line. An anti-tank missile hit one of the armored vehicles, but the vehicle withstood the impact. A kamikaze drone intercepted the other one. The explosion shook the men inside, but the metal continued its mission. The tree line lit up with more shots from Bushmaster. The lives of more Russians were snuffed out under the weight of the 25mm. The Ukrainian soldiers went out to start the hunt against the opponents who were still alive. This kind of quick attack made it possible to leave troops in front of the Russian outposts. Trained men ran into the woods. Their boots left marks on the ground, while their rifles searched for any remaining enemies. The advance still had to be careful. The wounded Russians could still be a threat, and even the fallen bodies received confirmation shots. The defensive position greatly favored the Russians and left the Ukrainians walking on high ground, making them easy targets. Some shots killed or forced Moscow soldiers out of their hiding places to surrender. The grenade launcher unleashed its fury against a defensive position. The Russian resistance was present, which forced the PKM to fire with everything the machine gun could unleash. These shots gradually broke the resistance. The approach was careful until it was clear that there was no perfidy on the part of the enemies. It wouldn't be the first time that a false surrender was recorded. The dead man's body lay beside the living. When that man was shot, he served as an example for the others to surrender. Evacuating troops or the wounded from dangerous positions after the attacks was difficult. A Bradley opened its ramp, so the men could carry their comrades inside. They went in while the smoke bombs obstructed the Russians' view. Moscow's troops' thermal cameras saw through that cover, putting an anti-tank missile directly onto the Bradley. It withstood the hit and kept moving. Shortly after, it went over a mine that exploded on its side, shaking the men inside the armored box. Even so, it completed its mission successfully, saving what was most important and impossible to repair or replace: the lives of the soldiers. Many souls would be lost in Kursk. The month of November ended after the Russians had already retaken almost 50% of the Ukrainian territory in Kursk. Now it was time for the battles to take place in more confined positions and in cities like Sudza. Following the Russian methodology, the locations would probably be completely bombarded as they did in Donetsk, but there was another possibility. The threat of a Moscow offensive in Zaporizhia could force Kyiv to withdraw troops from Kursk to protect another front. It was just a change of location where the violence would increase and new bodies would be left on ground already soaked with blood, but apparently still far from being saturated with its hunger for lives.